Okay. It's not perfect. So it's hard to do the relief valve part. Okay. So this is my RP here. So again, this is my test cock 1, test cock 2, test cock 3, test cock 4, my shutoff valve number 2, my shutoff valve number 1, my check valve 1, check valve 2, and then my relief valve. Okay? So just like this one, 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's 2 check valves in there. Check valve 1, check valve 2, and then I have my relief valve, right, which is this bottom part, right? So the way this works, okay, so I'm just gonna throw out some numbers to make the math a little easier, right? So the pressures that I'm gonna talk about are just gonna be random pressures, okay? So for this example, I'm gonna have 100 PSI coming in, right? Right? So we could even draw, here's my meter. So that meter is giving me 100 PSI, right? And again, it could vary, don't get hung up on that number. Okay.
Puede variar, dice. Lo que va entrando, lo que va saliendo de la mina, lo que va entrando en el BackFlow. Puede variar, dice. Ok, ese número de 100 PSI lo está usando como por ejemplo.
Sí.
Okay, so as we go through this number 1 check valve, when you become a certified tester, that's our first, we check that, right? So we want my check valve number 1 to hold back a minimum of 5 PSI, right? But normally we're around 7 or 8. So I'm going to go ahead with 8 PSI just to make the math a little bit easier.
A minimum of 5 PSI.
Yeah.
Ok, en la válvula, en el chequeo. Ok, número 1. Ok, tiene que tener un mínimo de 5 PSI que retiene de presión. Cuando, eso es cuando lo esté testeando. Okay? So, Brandon,
Yes, sir.
can we show him what it means by checking by checking with the
The cage.
Yeah.
Well, we'll go over that.
Okay.
We're just gonna go over how the hydraulics work and then
Okay.
how it protects against back pressure inside.
Okay, aquí nada más estamos
That's
repasando.
not important. That's not important.
Aquí nada más estamos repasando como el hidráulico trabaja
Right.
y a qué presión lo va tiene que retener.
Okay.
Okay?
So with that check valve number 1 holds back. Excuse me. Okay, so that number 1 check valve holds back 8 PSI.
Okay, un ejemplo, si la válvula, la válvula de chequeo número 1 retiene 8 PSI, ¿verdad?
Right. Okay, so the easiest way for me, because I always have to be imaginative, I gotta think of something, visualize it, right? So if I have 100 guys trying to get in, right, because I have 100 PSI, 100 guys, it's gonna take 8 guys to push that check valve up to let my 92 guys through.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Si tiene, uso otra analogía, un ejemplo. Si tiene 100 hombres, ¿ok? Y 8 hombres están reteniendo la válvula de chequeo número 1, él va a dejar pasar 92 hombres adentro. En otras palabras, 92, 8 PSI para retener la válvula, ¿ok? Y 92 PSI de presión para que pase.
Okay. Because remember we talked about the name of this, right? The RP, right? We call it the RP, right? The reduced pressure. So based off of that alone, we already know we drop 8 PSI, right? So here goes the name, right? So now this is what we call the zone pressure. Zone pressure is right here. So zone pressure is the pressure that I'm getting above my relief valve.
Okay.
Right. So after my number 1 check.
Ok, después de la válvula, como tenemos 100 PSI, después de la válvula de chequeo número 1, se considera a presión de zona, ok, que son 92, por eso le está diciendo ahí, porque son 92 PSI, ¿verdad?
So you're
Eso es en la
you're
chequeo
talking
número
about
2.
one of each of these, right?
Ahora ya.
Reducing almost 8 PSI in the first each one. Or just
No, no,
the
no.
first one?
Just the first one. Okay, that's a good point. Okay, so now I got 92. Now I want to go through check valve number 2, right? So check valve number 2 is just 2 psi,
Two.
right? So it's a weaker spring. And when we start taking these apart, we'll break all these apart, and that way you can see one's going to be real strong, one's going to be real weak. So if you are in the field, you know, because you guys are installers, right? So when you install it, sometimes does it leak?
Yeah.
Yeah, right? Because there's going to be dirt. It could be just a little things in there that are going to mess that up. So you want to open it up, you know, take it, everything out, open the on and off, get the flush it, right? So when we do our Wilkins training, manufacturer for here, they do amazing training that we go to, and they say, when you install it, flush it. Second step is flush it. Third step is flush it, and then the final 4th step is flush it. Right.
Okay.
Right. We ran into when we were up in Bogart Park doing that class. We had to flush because it was a galvanized line and it was old. Okay, so.
So we're at zone 2.
So yeah, so our check valve number 2 is going to hold back 2 psi. Right?
Okay,
So another reason why I brought that up about flushing, you open it up. If you accidentally switch those springs and you put the soft spring in the first area and the hard spring in the second one, it's just going to discharge. And I'm going to go over why that is.
Okay. What's that?
It has to always be a minimum of 5, no matter what. That's why when I test them, when we certify them, it's the same if it's a 3/4 or if it's an 8-inch. Remember I did that 8-inch I was telling you about? It's the same numbers we look for. That's what makes it easy.
No importa cuánto pesan tenga, siempre como mínimo de 5.8. En los segundos cuando
Bien vistoso,
Right. So that's why, it's another reason why some people shy away from an RP. Because the RP drops the most pressure, right? Right? The pressure vacuum breaker he has right there in front of him only has 1 check valve and it holds back only 2 psi. So if our pressure's already low, say we only have 50 psi or something like that, and we have a bunch of rotors, we want to put a pressure vacuum breaker if we can. Right? Okay, so another thing to look at, I have 100 psi on the back of that diaphragm in the relief valve, okay? Because this is still before the check valve, correct? So the water comes down here also and pushes that diaphragm closed, right? And it does that because I only have 92 psi trying to get out. I have 100 on the other side of the diaphragm. It stays closed, just like our irrigation valves do. We have more pressure on the top of the valve pushing down than we have pushing up. Remember that? Okay, and then again, I just lose 2 psi, so 90 psi go into my valves, right? Which is good.
So the end is coming tonight. At the end of this fall is coming 90, right?
Yes, correct. Okay, so my backflow's happy, right? I don't have any leaks, right? No leaks. Why not?
Abiertos que de este lado tiene 100, del otro tiene 92, por eso
Right. How come I don't have any leaks? Because I got more pressure closing it, right, than I have pushing back, right?
Ya no está liqueando, tú tienes más presión de ese lado.
Okay. So, let's go ahead and talk about back pressure, back siphonage, right? Okay, so we'll go over back pressure first, right? So you notice that all check valves, every check valve, water goes through one way and it can't come back the other way, right? Makes sense, right? One way pushes it open, the other way closes it. So if I have back pressure, so my 90 psi,
Si hubiera presión por atrás, sería más complicado.
something happens, right?
Algo pasa, tienen 125.
I go to 125 psi, right? Uh-oh, something's gonna happen. I don't know what's gonna happen, right? So it's coming back this way. This 90 right here is gonna turn to 125, right? Because the shutoff valve's open, that doesn't reduce the pressure. 125. What's my check valve number 2 gonna do?
Actually, it's gonna go
Close.
back
It's gonna close, right? Hopefully, right?
because
Because now the water's coming back. See, a quick thing to,
Okay, so because you have 100 psi on one side, and then you have 125 psi on the other side. So as your water comes down, as the water pressure increases right there, it should close.
but here's the thing took me a while, I overlooked this one step. So if the water's not moving, do you guys remember what that's called when the water's not moving from last week?
Static?
Static, right? When I'm in static, my check valves are closed, right? Makes sense, right? The spring's already closing it when the water, remember, static pressure pushes back, right? So it hits the valve, stops, and then it pushes back, right? So since it pushes back, the check valve's closed. Check valves are only open when water's moving, right? Because they're letting the water move. Because there's less pressure there, the water's moving. But when the static comes, they close. So my check valves are closed and static. Now, my relief valve has a spring that always wants to open, right? Now, is it going to be open in this static pressure issue? No, because I still have the 100 psi pushing it, right? So we just want to put wants to open. Right? So, if we're in static pressure mode, and then this just increases, right? In this example here, for some reason the water just starts increasing, but we're in static mode. That check valve is just going to get squished a little bit, but it's going to stay closed, right?
It stays closed.
Simple. That's easy, right?
So
Okay, so you guys are probably thinking, like, why is he going over this so much, so in depth? The reason why I do is because if you don't have to retain all this information, but if it kind of just makes sense, I'm going to go over what we normally see in the field, and we'll refer back to what's going on inside, and you'll know exactly how to repair it and what's going on with the backflow, right? Because for you, being a professional, these backflows, 95, 97% of our industry, the landscape industry, know nothing about backflows. Am I right?
Yeah.
We think we do, right? If this thing's leaking, for example, just first thing that pops in your head, if that is leaking, what's wrong with it? Well,
yes, diaphragm.
the diaphragm, right? Makes sense. What's wrong with the irrigation valve if it's leaking? The diaphragm, right? 99% of the problems with this RP
Check valve.
Check
One.
valve number 1. Okay? Alright. 99%. So, does that make sense?
Yeah. Amen.
Why it would be? Why would that be the main problem?
Back pressure.
No. Let's take a step back. What's his job? What's this number 1 check valve's job?
Reduces the pressure.
Exactly. Right?
If it's not reducing, it's gaining more than in the.
Exactly, right? So I'm gonna go over how that relief valve works and how crucial that is, right? So we did the easy one, back pressure, well, the check valve's gonna stay closed, right? And I'll go over if it doesn't, what happens, but, so, the number 1 check valve is responsible for the zone pressure, right? That zone pressure needs to be at least 5 psi lower, right? But usually it's around 8. We're using 8 for easier math to give me my 90 psi going, right?
Siempre es el número 1 el problema del valor check valve porque no está reduciendo la presión que está dando, ¿no? Si son 100, están 125, así que la reducción de presión no es así, ¿no? Bien.
Okay, so now we're going to we check our relief valve when we test. That's actually the first thing that we do when we certify it. We see what pressure difference that opens up, right? So my relief valve needs to open up at a minimum of 2 psi difference. Right? So, for example, so I'm at 92. If I'm at 100 psi coming in, if for some reason my zone pressure increases to 98,
And when you say for some kind of reason, for instance, like what do you mean?
why would that increase?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's two ways.
Okay, so entonces, lo que está diciendo es el PSI de la mira, dijéramos, está llegando a 100 PSI. Okay, y ya le cambió a él, como por ejemplo, en la zona, this is at your release valve, right?
This is a relief
But
valve.
98.
Yeah, well, yeah, then my zone pressure. That's
Okay.
after my check valve.
After you want?
Check valve number 1.
Okay, y si después de la válvula de chequeo número 1, ahí en la zona, okay,
So this one,
se sube a 98 PSI.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, so why would that change?
Okay, so one reason would be if I had back pressure.
Una de las razones que puede incrementar a 98 PSI es si hay back pressure.
And I had rock, something.
Oh, si hubiera una piedra o algo así, o no se reserva
Right.
bien.
So on that 125 example, it's going to get past it, right? Because it's not sealing. Now that pressure is going to increase here, right?
Okay, and it's gonna discharge.
It's going to discharge. Right?
Okay, la presión.
So no matter what, the RP is going to keep my inlet pressure, my meter side, higher than my lower side, right? So if for some reason this has increased my pressure, increased here, it's just going to overpower, because of the spring, open up and dump this side, always. So again, its job is to open up within 2 psi. Of it being too close, it's going to open up, drop, or in this case, drop my downstream. So it keeps a buffer of 2 psi difference at all times, no matter what. Right?
Okay.
So the back pressure usually is not an issue, right? I mean, it's very rare that we have that. So that was one of them. So what else can give me that 98 plus PSI? So So if water could come in this way, what about water coming in this way? Remember my 99% of the problem.
In case you increase that 100 psi, would that be a problem?
No. I get
Okay,
a rock
yeah.
in my number one check valve. So
Yeah.
that's not
Right.
holding back enough
Yeah.
pressure. Right? So depending on how big of a block you have, if you just have a little bit of dirt, just a little bit of discharge, right?
Now, okay. In case we're out in the field.
Right.
Okay, en caso de que estamos en el field, ¿verdad? Y si miramos que está descargando, if we see it discharging, okay, would it be wise to disassemble it, take out the springs and flush it to see if there is such a thing as a rock or something there that's impeding it from, podemos quitar los resortes para ver si por la razón de que está descargando agua?
There's the first thing that you want to do. Let me explain
Okay.
a little bit more, because there's tricks that I could walk up to the backflow
Mhm.
and immediately know what the problem is.
Okay.
Okay? But I don't want to explain that without explaining a little bit more of the things. That way it makes sense, right? Okay, so does that make sense? If my pressure, because remember I have full pressure here on the back side of this diaphragm, no matter what the check valve's doing, right? I always have 100 psi, right? In this example. Now, if my check valve has a rock or sand and it's letting a little bit out, once it gets to that 98 psi, too close, the relief valve opens up. Now, if a little bit of pressure comes in, the relief valve opens a little bit. So, have you ever seen a backflow like that? Leaking a little bit?
Yeah.
All the time? A lot, right? There's a lot of them. So, that just means that number one check valve is not completely sealed and holding back. A little bit of water is getting by, right? A little bit of water.
Dices, mira, un tacos que brequean un poquito, que dicen que no está bien cerrado, porque tiene tierra, tiene grado, tiene algo, no está muy sellado, por eso miras muchos.
I mean, it is a rubber good. We got to think about that. The seal is a rubber part, and it wears out. You know, if it goes too much and it wears out, then
So, backflows have 3 check valves. How many check valves do they generate?
well, the reduced pressure principle has 2
Okay,
and 1 relief valve.
and 1 relief
That's
valve.
how the relief valve works. It works. So the relief valve's job is it senses pressure on both sides before number one check and then after. And it plays tug of war. You can think about it, tug of war. They're pulling on each other all the time. Now one is always stronger, so it stays shut, right? But for some reason, my pressure increases. That could be by my number 2 failing and there's back pressure coming in, or that my number 1 just can't hold the pressure back, right? So, it'll discharge, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so let's go to, we went over back pressure, now we want to do back siphonage, right? Do you guys remember what's a back siphonage? What happens?
It sucks.
Like it's not,
Right. The meter side drops, right?
the water, no.
Drops water pressure. Okay? So again, we're gonna go over this example in static pressure. So in static pressure, my check valves are closed, right? Okay, so let's say we have a siphon. Let's say my 100 psi drops down to 5 psi, right? So, is all the water from my irrigation side going to come back?
No.
No, because my check valves are closed, right? They're closed. Am I going to get discharge? I am, right? Who's going to win that tug of war? 90 psi or 5 psi?
90 psi.
90 psi, right? It's going to open up.
Yeah.
So what this relief valve will do is going to drop this down to 0 psi, right?
Yes.
I just drew Bart Simpson right there on accident. Right, so it's gonna discharge.
So this thing can stop at any time if it's getting water back, or you have to.
Does any change in the pressure? If the pressure from my meter and my irrigation gets too close, it's gonna open and drop my irrigation side down.
So the water doesn't go.
Exactly. Does that make sense now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it is kind of complicated. You just think, oh, I put backflows in, right? We were talking about recycling.
So if you
How
try-
lucrative that is.
Estar en 90 de este lado y son 5, lo que va a hacer, el agua regresar al agua y eso es lo que va a hacer, se va a abrir para que no regrese el agua otra vez para la ciudad.
Y por eso es para prevenir que el agua se vaya otra vez en la línea. Es porque dompea el agua por aquí abajo, por el descargo.
Right, so do you see why it took me, like an hour, a little over an hour to explain that, but does it make sense now?
It's making more sense.
All it does is play off of pressure. So when we see that little bit of leaking, could it be the diaphragm?
No.
Yeah, I mean, it can.
Okay.
Okay, it can. If there's a little bit of a tear or something in there, well, yeah, it's not going to hold that 100 psi back. It's going to leak a little bit and then it's going to open, right?
But you will start getting used to that. As you see the backflow, you kind of determine how old the backflow is or how new it is. And then you, like you said,
Well-
you could go out to the field and kind of figure out by looking at it, okay, maybe this.
Okay, so I'm going to give you 2 tips that I learned that changed my whole life.
Dice que nos va a dar 2 tips para que cambiaron la vida de él, dice.
Changed my whole life, right? After I learned these 2 things, man, I've been rolling in the dough now, right? No, but two things that I read, and I kind of overlooked it, right? It wasn't until one of my students that took a further step, went to San Diego Canyon College and took a backflow repair class, and actually told me something. You know, I have a really good relationship with this gentleman, you know, and we're always bouncing things off each other. That's what I really like about doing these classes. You know, I build relationships, and then I get people that, you know, I teach them something, they go run with it, you know, and they make something out of it. And then, you know, they're telling me things, you know. That's the greatest feeling ever, is to teach somebody something, and then they come back and teach you something on top of that, right? That's why I do this. I love this. Okay, so, and again, this is in my textbook that I read and I'm certified on, and I just jumped over this, okay? So, if I have a backflow and it's discharging, right?
Okay, si tiene un backflow, lo que nos va a explicar él es lo que le pasó a él. Si tiene un backflow y está descargando,
Right? All the time,
siempre está descargando.
not stopping.
No para, no tiene para.
What could it be?
¿Qué
Just
puede
off,
ser?
just off the top of the head.
¿Qué puede ser? Nada más de su cabeza.
Right. Well, it could be any of the 3 things, right? I could have bad pressure with a bad check valve. I could have a bad number 1 check valve. I could have a bad relief valve.
Puede ser una de 3 cosas. Puede tener que la presión de atrás sea más, que la presión de enfrente sea más, o que el check relief valve esté descargando.
I think the first thing you need to do is close both sides and check if it's still leaking.
The easiest, fastest thing to do is this. You go up to it right away. You open up the number 4 and the number 3 test cock, right?
Lo más rápido dice que abre el número 4 and the number 3 y el test cock es que número 3.
Right? If it stops or slows down, and that means that my number 1 check valve,
With the back open, right?
Yep. my number 1 check valve is failed.
Cuando los abra, ok, y si y si para, quiere decir que la válvula de chequeo número 1 no está trabajando bien.
Right? If it stays the same, it's the relief valve.
Que si se queda dompeando todavía, es la válvula de release.
Seems simple enough, right? Well, that's pretty easy, okay? But why?
Se ve simple, pero ¿por qué? Dice la pregunta.
What are we doing when we open up number 4, number 3?
¿Qué estamos haciendo cuando abrimos?
Moderando la presión.
We're releasing water, yeah, right? So this is number 3 and this is number 4. So if it's discharging, in my example, I'm pretty sure I got 98 PSI there, right? So anything more than that's gonna leak out, right? So by opening these,